And at that time, I mean, the issue of vaccination has such a different valence in the culture now than it did back then. And a part of what made it an interesting topic at the time for me to explore was that it was maybe the only like really, I don't know, hot button issue where knowing somebody did not vaccinate their kids did not necessarily tell you anything else about their politics. Like it wasn't correlated with, being a Democrat or Republican back then. And so that made it interesting and messy. And so it allowed for the possibility you could create a world where everybody, liked and respected each other. And there was just this one thing that they couldn't find common ground on.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Scene Podcast. I'm your host, Justin Borak, joined by my beautiful, wonderful, amazing producer, editor, KJ. KJ, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty good, Justin. I just cracked open a can of liquid death. I am one happy camper.
That is amazing. Today we have one of the coolest interviews ever for you. That is right. We are talking to Tony Award winner, Jonathan Spector, the writer of Eureka Day. It was such an honor to get to chat with him, to learn about his process and the way he works. It was so, so cool. I do want to say before we get into the interview, this episode was recorded before John was even nominated. So we talk a lot about Eureka Day. We talk a lot about the show. We talk a lot about his work. But if you're wondering why the Tony win isn't brought up, it's because we interviewed him beforehand. And I was just as obsessed with him before as I am now. So yeah, I am not going to hold this back any longer. Let's get right into the episode. And I can't wait for you guys to hear everything John and I have to talk about. The Scene Podcast is sponsored by Broadway Book Club, the only subscription box that delivers the magic of theater straight to your door. 7 scripts delivered 4 times a year, from Broadway hits to hidden gems. Broadway Book Club is perfect for theater lovers, educators, and performers alike. It's the easiest way to grow your library and spark your next great production. Join the club. Learn more at BroadwayBookClub.com. All right, I'm here with Jonathan Spector. Jonathan Spector is a playwright based in Oakland, California, whose work has been produced on and off Broadway, regionally and internationally. He's worked with acclaimed theaters like Manhattan Theater Club, the Old Vic, Syracuse Stage, Theater J, and Miami New Drama, just to name a few. Most recently, his play, brilliantly hilarious Eureka Day, ran on Broadway to rave reviews, and we are so excited to have him today. Jonathan, how are you?
I'm good. Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Oh, of course. I'm so excited to have you. The first interaction I ever had with you is when I made my video last year of my favorite shows of all of 2024. You were very much in the upper echelon of that list. And Eureka Day is just truly one of my favorite things I saw all year long. It was amazing.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. But I want to start. I like to start most of these episodes out talking about people's beginnings and like where they started. You know, we're the Scene Podcast. We have a ton of listeners who are like high school teachers and college teachers and high school and college students. So I want you to talk a little bit about like your early journey as a creative, as a playwright. What were those early years like? Who were like teachers or mentors that inspired you? Where did this kind of choice to go into this scary but wonderful field come from?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I sort of backed into this choice, certainly vis-a-vis playwriting, and it sort of took me a long time to get there. I mean, I had been writing from kind of a young age and had a creative writing teacher in junior high and high school who I really liked and was very encouraging. And I had started doing theater in high school too, but more. I feel like at that time in my life, I would have said like the literature and writing was more the artistic drive, and the theater was more like for fun and social parts of it. And then I got to college and kept doing theater and was writing less in part, which is what weren't a lot of sort of avenues for that at the college I was at, and started directing more in college because it became clear I was not a good actor. But I really liked the process, and I didn't, at that time, I think I wasn't really aware of kind of contemporary playwriting as like a thing. Like I
Yeah.
didn't even, hadn't read plays that were published in the past,
Mhm.
5 or 10 years, like
Yeah.
think, when I was in college, like in the early 2000s or late 90s, early 2000s, like maybe, Angels in America was like the most contemporary play we had like read,
Yeah.
so, yeah, it just didn't, it just wasn't, um, I don't know, in my field of vision, but I like doing theater, and after college was like, oh, I should try and be a director, and kind of move to New York, not having any idea kind of what that meant or how to go about doing that.
Mhm.
And was in New York for a while, unsuccessfully trying to do that, and but got to learn a lot in that time, and did a bunch of assistant directing, and just got to be in a lot of really cool rooms, even if I wasn't really kind of making a lot of my own artistic work.
Yeah.
And then eventually met the woman who is now my wife in the Lincoln Center Directors Lab,
Mhm.
and followed her ultimately back to where she is from in Northern California. And when I got here, um, we had a theater company for a long time, a small theater company. It was doing a lot of new work, a lot of the kind of exciting, downtown playwrights that I had gotten to encounter when I was in New York. And then I
Yeah.
was also working. I also worked for on and off for 5 or 6 years for this organization called Playwrights Foundation, who are the ones who run the Bay Area Playwrights Festival, among
Oh,
other
cool.
things. And I was the literary manager there for most of that time, in addition to doing some of the producing. So I got to read, I mean, we would get, I don't know what it was, 500 or 600 submissions maybe, and I personally probably read half of them, or most of half of them. So I was just reading an enormous volume of plays during that time,
Mhm.
and yeah, and it was only when I left that job and had a little bit of a kind of a like, what am I going to do with my life moment, and like I was directing, but not. It wasn't my passion in that way, and then I sort of backed into like starting to do some writing, and
Yeah.
applied to law school, and I was like, I'm like, almost 30. I need some way to like make money.
You'd be surprised
I have no skills.
how many playwrights I've
Um,
chatted with that applied to law school at a point
right.
before
And then
going
at
yeah,
like at
yeah.
the very last minute after I'd applied to law school, which I didn't even really want to do, I also applied. I had like started writing a little bit. I'd written some short plays, maybe, and I worked on some devised projects, and
Mhm.
applied to this MFA creative writing program at San Francisco State that had like a sort of playwriting subfield,
Mhm.
um, just because it's very cheap, and it was local and sort of easy to do. And I don't think I didn't even have a full length play to submit at the time. I submitted a couple of short plays, but I sort of knew the people who taught there, and so I ended up doing that instead of law school,
Mhm.
and kind of slowly, um, transitioned more and more to kind of playwriting being the thing that I was doing
Yeah.
exclusively. And once I did, it felt like, oh well, this is much more the right fit for me.
Mhm. Do you remember what your first play was that you wrote? Even if it was like a short play or something?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a play in college. That I don't. Yeah, I don't have anymore. I studied abroad at Trinity
Mhm.
College in Dublin for a year, and I took a playwriting class, and I wrote a play, and I remember sort of like a sort of family drama. But I don't. I wish I still had it, because I don't know what happened to it. I don't. And then I did, and then I didn't write another play, um, until I was 30. I think is
Yeah.
when a full length play. So
It's a long jump between I would love to see that first play that you wrote in Dublin.
yeah,
Just
yes,
8 years before
me
you ever
too.
wrote something else, yeah.
Maybe it's somewhere in some box in like my parents' attic or something. I have
Yeah.
to try
Oh,
and dig
that's
it up.
awesome. Well, I wanna talk a little bit more about specifically, like, what inspires you as a playwright. I feel
Mhm.
like, especially with Eureka Day, which we're gonna talk a lot about later, you do such a good job of, like, diving into social commentary in your work. Is there, like what inspires you when you come up with an idea of a piece? Is it, like, reading a lot of plays, or do you, like, watch the news, or is it something that you, like, percolate on for a really long time? It's just something that interests you and it slowly becomes a play? How does that, like, early stages of process look for you?
Yeah, I mean, these days for me, I feel like as I've written more plays, and kind of been doing this a little longer, I think one of the things I have gotten better at is recognizing, when I have an experience or an encounter, or I read something or see something and think, oh, maybe there is a play here.
Mhm.
Whereas I feel like when I first started plays, started writing plays, I really didn't know, what one should write a play about. I mean, and on
Yeah.
some level, like I still don't know, and nobody knows, and
Mhm.
that's the real answer. But and when I was living in New York in my early 20s, um, the first thing I did in professional theater is I was an assistant director for this play called Attempts on Her Life by Martin Crimp. I don't know if you know
Mhm.
that play. It's like one of the, sort of a seminal British
Yeah.
1990s kind of experimental work. And they were doing
Yeah.
it to her rep, it was directed by Steve Cosson, who at that
Oh,
time
very
was
cool.
just starting the Civilians. They had done one show, I think, and then I ended up assisting him on like a couple shows after that with the Civilians. And the way they, at least at that time, would make their work is to just kind of, try and like find like what the question is that they're trying to answer with the play, and
Yeah.
then go out and do a bunch of interviews with people. And so I think in some ways that um, entry point into a play, sort of stuck with me. And so, of trying to find like what is the question here that I the thing I don't understand, that I need the process of writing a play to be some kind of answer to. So for
Yeah.
Eureka Day, it was, I mean, it was sort of two things coming together. One is that I had a commission from this theater in Berkeley called Aurora, and we remember it differently. The former artistic director, remembers that he asked me to write something very specifically Berkeley, and in my mind, that was my idea, but I'm sure he's right. Um, and so I wanted to write something that felt very Berkeley, and I had the experience um, recently at that time of just sort of being in conversation with friends or acquaintances and people who were um, at least as smart and well educated as I was, who had kind of the same politics that I did,
Yeah.
but and then discovering they didn't vaccinate their kids, and just sort of this strange, in sort of floor dropping out moment of just like, how is it that we can kind of agree on basically everything, but in this one very specific aspect, like you live in a different reality than I do. And so
Yeah.
that was kind of the thing that spurned me into it. And I started with like doing a bunch of interviews and research, and then just kind of um, followed that, where it went. And at that time, I mean, that, the issue of vaccination has such a different valence in the culture now than it did back then. And a part of
Yeah.
what made it an interesting topic at the time for me to explore was that it was maybe the only like really, I don't know, hot button issue where knowing somebody did not vaccinate their kids did not necessarily tell you anything else about their politics. Like it wasn't correlated with, being a Democrat or Republican back then. And so that made it interesting and messy. And so it allowed for the possibility you could create a world where everybody, liked and respected each other, and there was just this one thing that they couldn't find common ground on, versus like, if it's like a similar play about like gun control, like you're just not gonna,
It's
people will be
always kind of
dismissive of the other people kind of from this outset. And so it's just less
yeah.
interesting.
It does feel like you made Eureka like while reading and getting to see Eureka Day, it did very much feel like a piece that took an issue that I think to a lot of us seemed very black or white and forced everyone to sit in this very uncomfortable gray that like the adults at that school at Eureka Day like are forced to sit in and stew in, and it's wonderful. Um I I want to talk let's talk about Eureka Day because God, I've been wanting to talk about it with you since I've seen it. The play is just so wonderful. It's so smart and brilliant, and I think one of the coolest things about it is, like, the life that it lived. So it started in 2018, correct? Or the first, like, production of it was in
Hmm.
2018, and I wanna talk a little bit about, like, what it was like seeing or having audiences see it at that time, before the pandemic, before anything happened. What was that like?
Yeah, I mean, that process of writing that play and through to its premiere was really just like the best um, development process that I've ever been a part of, because I live in Oakland, but I can bike there from my house. So it was very easy to kind of
Yeah.
go. I would, and they were very. They had just launched this new commissioning program. It was one of the first plays they commissioned through it, and so they were very open in terms of tell us what you need for
Yeah.
support. And so I brought in maybe 40 pages and, we sat around the table with some actors and read it. And then I brought in, maybe a full draft a month later and we sat, and we just, there, maybe 4 or 5, 6 kind of development phases like that with increasing amounts of time, increasing support. We did a reading, did a workshop, and we picked up actors kind of along the way, who ended up being in the production. So 2 of the people who were in the room, that first day we read those 40 pages around the table, I think none of those 40 pages are in the play anymore, but they ended up being in the production. So who they were very much like informed the development of their characters, and that kind of continued all the way
Yeah.
through. And so by the time we got into rehearsal, everybody was already so deeply invested and was bringing so much to it, and it was a really just wonderful process. And then the production itself was incredibly well received and people really responded to it. But um, at the time, I certainly had the question of like, well, it makes me very happy that it works out as I hoped, that it's sort of this play for Berkeley people and the Berkeley people are enjoying it. But I really had no sense of whether anybody outside of Berkeley would connect to it.
Yeah.
And so it was exciting to discover that people began to get excited about it. So then um, it had a couple of more productions before COVID. It was
Mhm.
I don't know how granular you want me to go into of sort of the path of the like develop of
Yeah,
the.
the big thing that I wanna so, like, you have these other productions, and it goes to Off-Broadway before the pandemic, right?
Mhm.
And
Yes.
then I saw that there was this virtual reading with the Off-Broadway
Uh-huh.
cast, like,
Yeah.
during the brunt of in the thick of the
Right.
lockdown. I was wondering, like, when did because obviously we can talk a little bit about Eureka Day, a play, kinda looking into vaccinations in the school called Eureka Day, um, and it's looking very much from all these different sides at this very liberal, like, what kinda school would you call it again? It's a, like
It's well, the term they use is an independent school, but it's
independent
like a very progressive private school.
Yeah, like a very progressive private school looking to vaccination rules and stuff like that.
Hmm.
My thought is like right when March 2020 happens and this pandemic hits,
Hmm.
do you like immediately start thinking like, "Oh my god, this play now has taken on a whole new life," or like what was the inciting incident that made you like want to put this up as a virtual reading and realize kind of the I don't know the change story that this has now become, the like very different life it's taken on.
Oh, I think there's sort of separate things. The virtual reading was just, I don't remember exactly how it came about, but it was that early COVID phase when everybody was just like,
Everybody was doing
oh, let's
virtual
do
reading?
something. And so,
Yeah,
of course, everyone's available because everyone's
yeah,
just stuck at home.
everyone's
So
home,
we
yeah.
did it. And that was kind of fun. And it was lovely. That was a great reading. And I felt the same way. I don't know if you saw the virtual reading that they did around the same time of Heroes of the Fourth Turning. But like,
Yeah,
you know, when you do a virtual reading with actors who have just done a run of the play, it's so rich because they've already learned from the
they know
audience
the
like how the
yeah,
play
they know
works,
it.
versus like a then what we were doing later in COVID, where you're just doing these kind of virtual readings that feel like they're just in the vacuum of space,
Yeah,
and that's not always as
just doing
satisfying.
it to do
But
it kind of, yeah.
so that was sort of just like a one-off thing that happened. But um, it had this production at this company called Core, um, in New York in 2019, fall 2019, and it had been really well received,
Mhm.
critically and from the audience, and that sparked a bunch of interest from producers. So by the time COVID hit, we were already Sonia Friedman, the producer, had already optioned it and was. We were talking. I think at that time the discussion was like, she wanted to try and do it fall of 2020 on the West End. So, so it was like already in motion. And then COVID hit. And so my thought was actually like, oh, well, that's it. The play's dead. Like
Yeah.
nobody's going to want to do a play about or think about vaccines and viruses 2 months from now when we come out of COVID, which is of course
Yeah.
what everybody
Oh,
was
yeah.
thinking at the time. So I, and it really was, uh, I feel like one of the things that helped me through, like hang on through that time and not just like abandon theater entirely was, Sonia pretty early on, like saying that she was still really committed to this play and to me, and that wanted it to be one of the first things that she put up after we came out of COVID, once she
Yeah.
had reopened all of her other shows that she had to close.
Mhm.
So, but of course, then by the time we finally got there, then we were in such a different world than
Yeah.
in terms of this stuff than we were before, and I didn't. It took me a while to think about what that means, and I didn't do a ton of rewriting when it was in London in 2022, but I did do much more for this production. Not so much changing anything in terms of how they relate to the vaccine, but there's just stuff where things that were there's just a lot of stuff that everybody already knows now that we don't need to
Yeah,
hear the characters
that was
say.
something I wanted to ask you was, like, how was the after? Because obviously, like, it came to Broadway this past year, 2024, and
Mhm,
the world is far more acquainted with vaccines and the conversation
mhm.
around them than I think ever before. So, how was the, like, either rewriting or editing process, or did you, like, look at the script after the pandemic going into Broadway and be like, "A lot of this, like, is either, like, well known to the world now, or a lot of this maybe, like, hits too close to home, or you took things differently," or I don't know. Was there a, COVIDifying of the script at all? Like, were you looking at it through this new lens that you had to kinda figure out, like, what an audience's new reaction would be? Because obviously an audience from 2018 and an audience now is going to look at this play incredibly differently.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I mean, I did a fair bit of rewriting kind of towards the end of the play,
Mhm.
for this production, but it was less about COVID and more about kind of clarifying and sharpening some of the story,
Yeah,
and kind of how it resolves and how it ends. Not in a way that changes it, but in a way that I feel like was very um, loosely implied, and just kind of making some of that more explicit in terms
yeah,
of the decisions that are made, and it's also the thing of, I mean, it's COVID, but it's also that we were in maybe our second week of rehearsal during the election, and I naively thought the election was going to go the other way, and so I had this whole idea in my mind of like what the play was going to mean and feel like, with President Harris,
yeah.
and so had to kind of. I don't know that
Very,
it really
very different vibe,
changed.
yeah.
That I don't know that I wasn't in any way consciously rewriting as a result of this, but certainly like the play means something very different after
Yes.
the in the election of Trump, is particularly because like I began writing the play in the lead up to the 2016 election, and I think grappling with the way that so much of the country lived in a different reality than I lived in, very much, informed the writing of the play on some level. So that to then be back here again, but worse,
Mhm.
was a very. I mean, I now think of the play in a way as like. Um, Not that this was the intent, but I feel like this is the meaning it holds when I watch it now, as like a document of how we got here. That like for all of the
Yeah,
like careful um, language and caretaking and good intent, there are certain challenges that this mode of operating for us on the left like doesn't seem to be up to meeting, at
yeah,
least in the way we were doing it, obviously, because if
mhm,
we were, we would not have had Trump reelected. So like we failed, like
yeah,
whatever we were doing, it didn't work.
it didn't work.
So that I feel like that's a piece of what the play is about now for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I also wanted to ask, I mean, obviously, the pandemic was such a huge factor in every person on the
plan its life. And I know you went straight from London to New York or there was a London production, then a New York production. I was wondering how were the audience reactions relatively similar? I know that I was going to bring up the New York production also was in the thick of the election,
Mhm.
and the reaction to the election. So I didn't know what it was like seeing it on this massive stage in the UK and seeing it on this massive stage in New York, both post-pandemic, but both very different environments. What was that like seeing those two different productions go up?
Yeah, I mean, it was. I mean, in certain ways, very different, and in certain ways, not. I find it very hard to unpack when is a different audience reaction a result of that audience and that culture, is a result of the particularities of that production and the people who are making it, is a
Mhm.
result of just like the moment of time we're in, and I think it's really hard to disentangle those things.
Yeah.
So the one aspect of it is I think there was a general feeling, I mean, I don't know in so much from the audience, but critically, that regardless of how much the critics liked it, because they were, different people felt differently, but they all, many of them agreed that it was kind of this exaggeration of how liberals in California act, that people don't really act this way or do this. And that was never the response the play has had in the United States. So
Yeah.
I think to some degree that is like the British not understanding Americans, and particularly not understanding like Northern California Americans. And so, because like when we did it in Berkeley, there was supposed to was like, oh, this is exactly who we are,
This is
so
exactly.
um,
Yeah.
that is a piece of it. I think the other thing that's changed, which is much more um, about time, is um, like the first scene of the play before before sort of things have really started to go haywire.
Mhm.
I think there's a way in which this kind of, and they're just sort of discussing, what kind of identities should be on this drop down menu of, for admissions. And I think in 2018 and 2019, this mode of operating, I think people outside of Berkeley were able to receive it as like, oh yeah, that's how people are in California. Like it wasn't freighted with meaning in
Yeah.
the way that now I think, particularly after the election, people have a lot of feelings about this mode of operating, in that they
Yeah.
didn't, and it sort of holds a kind of meaning that it didn't back then. So that, and I think that means one thing in New York in 2024. It meant something different in London in 2022, where they were just
Yeah.
coming out of lockdown and having their own cultural fights that were different. And um, so I mean, I guess the answer is yes. It did land differently in different places, but it's really hard to say
Mhm.
exactly how and why, because there's um, so many factors.
Yeah, no, of course. And the last thing I wanna ask about with Eureka Day was, I think, probably one of the most famous scenes from the play. It was the front photo on every review, and everyone talked about it, was the Zoom scene. I
Yeah.
wanna talk about, like, one, obviously, I've read it recently, and I've read it in the last, like, year-ish. So I read it before it went to Broadway, but I didn't know, how much has that scene changed since 2018? Because I remember watching it in person and being like, "This is so reminiscent of every Zoom room I was in, like, May of 2020 and June of 2020, when people were, like, in the thick of, like, getting everything done in these virtual workspaces, in these virtual town halls." And I was so surprised when I realized that you wrote it in 2018. I was wondering, like, that specific scene, as a writer, what was it like writing something with so much non-spoken dialogue being, like, the comedic driving force of a scene, but then also writing through all of those Zoom years of that being such a primary form of communication in the world?
Writing it was extremely tedious and difficult, just because like anytime you would make a change, it has this sort of cascade of effect on kind of the timing of everything else. But but the scene itself has barely changed from its first iteration, except for like, oh, I have a better joke here that
Yeah,
I,
yeah, yeah.
or like, no, this joke is too good and there's too much laughter, and then we miss this line that it's important for the audience to hear. So so it was really technical stuff like that was the
Yeah.
only changes. And except in the first iteration and before COVID, the technology they were using was explicitly Facebook Live, because that was which
Okay.
nobody remembers that exists.
Yeah.
But that was sort of what people were using at the time. I've never had a more intense um, example of the way in which you don't understand how a play works until you put it in front of an audience. Because
Yeah.
with that scene, for that first production in Berkeley, the discussion we were having on the production team was like, is anyone gonna pay attention to this text, or are they just gonna kind of ignore it and watch the actors?
Yeah.
Um, and we sort of, as a very old subscriber base of that theater, we sort of assumed that's what was going to happen, and that was fine. It was like the scene still works; it's just sort of ambiently in the background.
Yeah.
And then the first time we had an audience, like, you couldn't hear a single word on stage because it was sort of laughter all the way through. I had at the time a like constant comments like all the way through, so there was no breaks. And so then I was like, oh
Okay.
wait, I have to like sculpt this more if
Yeah,
I
yeah, yeah.
want certain things to be foregrounded,
Anything to be
and
heard by the audience.
yes,
'Cause
and
truly,
then
I've never heard
yeah,
louder laughter in a Broadway theater than during that scene. It was
yes.
just
No,
wild.
yes. Yeah, and it's still, yeah, I mean, that still is like the strangest, like, 15 minutes or in the theater is like that first performance of just being like not only myself, but like everybody in the production team just like looking around each other, like, what is happening right now? Nobody had any expectation. And now it's very strange because I know that's how the scene works. And so, but having been involved in so many different productions, it's always very awkward to say to a group of actors, like, well, don't worry, there's going to be so much laughter here that like nobody's like, we don't have to spend a whole rehearsal day like finding the like tiniest nuances of this moment, because literally no one will hear it.
Yeah.
Then everybody looks at you like you've just cursed them, and
Yeah.
and so it's that's always and then of course the first performance is everyone's
They
like, oh, okay,
understand,
now,
yeah.
now I understand what you mean.
Yeah.
um but yeah, it's a very, I mean, and of course that scene had such a response before COVID in a similar way, but the response now is much more intense
Mhm.
because everyone has lived through that in
Mhm.
a many many times. I mean, during COVID, because I had um had a couple productions, like I would constantly get these like screenshots from people who were like on these like school Zooms, where they're like, I'm inside your play,
I'm
it's like
inside your play.
you know
That's so funny.
yeah
Oh god. It's such a good scene. I feel like you struck gold with that one. Just writing that in 2018, it's so interesting that like that it hasn't changed that much, because truly it felt like so many rooms that like I or people that I know have been in the last like couple years. It's so interesting. But Eureka Day's wonderful, and I love talking so much about it. But I want to talk about this other play you wrote called This Much I Know. It's one of my like favorite pieces I've read this year. I loved it so much. I want to talk a bit about it. Can you share like where this play originated and what inspired you to write this play? It's written in like the format of a lecture. It kind of goes all over the place in different like like eras in the world, and it all looks into the question of like how much responsibility we bear for things that we can't control, which I think is such an
Mhm.
interesting thesis for a play. So yeah, can you talk a little bit about This Much I Know?
Yeah, I think that the initial spark of it was reading Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And Daniel Kahneman is, he and his partner, I mean, they were Nobel Prize winning psychologists, but their Nobel Prize was in economics because they basically, sort of revolutionized the field of economics and sort of psychology with this um, sort of decision, like the science of decision making, and
Mhm,
and 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 really, like, when we talk about cognitive biases in our decision making, like a lot of it sort of comes out of their work, and the way that our brain is kind of this like pattern recognition thing machine
mhm,
that is like making a lot of quick decisions we're not even aware of, and then versus our like methodical slow thinking brain that we rarely use.
yeah,
um and there was something about reading that book where in the book he will sort of show you these experiments, and you can kind of feel yourself making these cognitive errors that he's talking about, and something about that kind of engagement somehow felt very theatrical to me. And so I had this idea like, oh, maybe somehow this could be a play, even though I had no idea how. And I was thinking about it, and also in terms of I've always been very obsessed with the work of Complicité. I don't know if you know
Mhm.
that company, British theater company. Simon McBurney run them. They do, they do all devised work, but they have this way of taking these very heady topics and making them extremely visceral and theatrical
Mhm.
and beautiful. And so I've always been like, I've always had the idea that I wanted to write a play that worked like that. Of course, it's very different because they devised the work,
Yeah.
so it's very physical too. So I sort of had that idea, but I just didn't know what to do with it, and it was just sort of in the back of my mind. And then I was, this is the sort of embarrassing true story. Is I was there, Berkeley Rep has this summer development program called the Ground Floor, where you
Mhm.
apply not with a play, just with like a pitch of your. It could be a play that you've written, or it could be an idea. It's sort of very, at the time at least, it was very flexible, whatever you want. And
Yeah.
I was like working on the application for some other play, but I just felt like it wasn't very inspired by it, and I wasn't going to do it. And I was driving home from seeing a show in San Francisco with my friend, the playwright Deepika Guha, and I was telling her like, I'm just not going to apply. And she was like, you know what? No, she's like, the deadline isn't until midnight. You have like 2 hours. Just do it. Just like make something up and send it in. And I was like, all
Mhm.
right, I'll do it. And so I was like, all right, it's going to be this thing with like about Daniel Kahneman's ideas, and I had these couple of other things I've been obsessed with that like maybe could be a play. I was like, oh, this thing about um, there was this New York article about people who accidentally kill people, and then and the sort of trauma of that. And then there was also the story of this guy Derek Black, who was the son of the person who created this white nationalist website Stormfront, who went
Mhm.
to the college I went to years after I did, and then you know ultimately sort of disavowed all of his like white nationalist beliefs he was raised with, and
Yeah.
blah, blah. So I just sort of threw this all the applications, like these things are all going to come together somehow and be a play. And then I was accepted into the Ground Floor, and I was like, oh gosh, I guess I have to write this play now. And so yeah, so I just spent like 2 weeks basically just like sitting in a room, at Berkeley Rep, and kind of hammered out the first 15 or 20 pages of the play, and then set it aside for a long time, and came back to it kind of in fits and starts. And it
Mhm.
had a very slow, very long development process to
Yeah.
kind of land ultimately where it has.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And where was did it premiere at Berkeley Rep, or did it?
No, it actually also premiered at Aurora in
Cool.
Berkeley, and then although unfortunately I was like it was the exact same time as Eureka Day in London, and I was mostly in London, so I wasn't able to be around for that process very much. And then it had another production also in London at the Hampstead Theatre,
Mhm.
and then it had a production at Theater J in Washington D.C., which in that production in Theater J is going to transfer in the fall off Broadway, although can't yet announce where, but it will be in New York in
Oh, that's awesome.
I think September. So I'm very excited about that because I really it was a great production, and I'm very happy it's going to get more life.
That's amazing. Jonathan, thank you so much for talking to me today. I
Yeah, of course.
was so excited. The last thing I wanted to ask was if you're working on anything or have anything coming up. So that's so exciting that this much I know is coming to New York, hopefully, or in the future. Yeah, are you working on anything else that you can talk about?
I am. I have a brand new play that is opening next week in is it next week? Where are we? Yes. Next week
Wow.
in Miami. This play called Birthright. They will be at Miami New Drama. I'm home right now, and they're in tech. I'm going back on Sunday
Oh,
to
sweet.
Miami, and I'm really excited about it. It was also, I mean, it's the hardest thing I've ever tried to write, and the whole thing has been so insane, and I kind of can't believe that it's come together as well as it has. But that they commissioned me. Well, it was a lot, about a year and a half ago. I kept saying no, so I finally said yes to this commission about you know I don't know, March of last year, and it was put in the season before I'd started writing a word.
Mhm.
And so it's been a very insane timeline and process and subject matter, since it's about the it's a play really about the sort of fracture of the American Jewish community post October 7th, but also the kind of long trail of getting there. So also very much just about like the American Jewish experience in the 21st century. So an easy, subject to
Super
tackle
easy, simple subject
in
matter, not
7 months.
at all.
But miraculously somehow it's sort of coming together. I mean, it's kind of a big, long play. I've cut almost 100 pages from the first day of rehearsal till
Oh
now.
my
So
gosh.
it's I mean, I can't believe that it's as that it's happening and that it feels coherent, because I didn't feel like that was particularly
Yeah.
likely, a few months ago.
That's amazing. That's so exciting. It's called
So
Birthright?
it's called Birthright. Yeah.
Sweet. Well, I
Yes.
cannot wait to
And
read it. And seriously, Jonathan, thank you so much for being here on the show and talking with us.
oh yeah, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate your advocacy of new plays. And I mean I and your TikToks and all of it, because I had a time in my life, when I was the literary manager for Barry Players Festival, where I was like reading so many plays, and I just really felt like I was like really on the pulse of like new playwriting, like every new up and coming playwright, like people in MFA programs, like I knew who everybody was, I knew what they were writing. It was so exciting, and
Mhm.
I'm just like not in the loop as much anymore of like new. I mean, I read plays and I see plays, but not the way
Yeah.
not sort of having my arms around everything that's happening in the way I once did. So I love seeing people out there who are kind of, you know,
Yeah.
carrying the
Look,
torch for
it's my
new
favorite. I
stuff.
love reading new plays and I love seeing
Um,
new pieces constantly. And I've read literally as much as I can from your canon, and it's just so good. So,
thank you so
seriously,
much.
thank you so much, Jonathan.
And that's our show. Thank you guys so much for listening to the Scene Podcast. A massive thanks to the team over at the Scene, KJ, Leah, Zach. I could not do it without you. You guys are absolutely everything. Thank you so much to Jonathan Spector. Oh my gosh, I am so incredibly excited that we got to chat with him before all of the crazy stuff happened, but chat with him about everything and all the things that he does. It absolutely means the world. So John, thank you so much. Everyone go read, produce everything, Eureka Day, all of John's work. It's absolutely wonderful. Yeah, guys, and thank you so much for listening. Follow us on the Scene, or on Instagram at The Scene News. Check out our website, thescenenews.com. Check out that newsletter. I'm sure you're always looking there, but we have amazing, amazing work in there. And you might see a familiar face. I've been writing a shows for everyone who's been asking why we haven't been doing shows you should know as much on the podcast. It's because now it's in written form and it's on the newsletter every single week. So you can go check out the newsletter to read the written version of the shows you should know that I put together every week for the newsletter. Yeah. So thank you guys so much. I'm going to end this episode the way I end every episode, by acting as though I'm a very scared and nervous theater student who just performed his first ever Shakespearean monologue. Yeah, okay, ready? And scene. Is it doth or doth? Is it doth or doth? Is it doth or is it doth? It's doth. It's doth. God, it's doth. Oh, I'm sorry. See you next time. Bye.